So yes, thank you indeed. It's really a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you to everybody who has attended as well. It's a lovely big audience. This lecture, Literary Reading and Mental Health, is essentially divided into two parts. And in the first half, I'll be discussing literary reading and mental health as a broad field, which is very contemporary and of the moment, and which has a time-honoured history. And in the second half, I'll draw on some of the empirical research that I've conducted with colleagues and partners here in Liverpool and elsewhere. And I'll be asking why literary reading fits in mental health care. If you're interested enough, see if I can move this on. If you're interested enough to listen to a lecture with this title, you may well possess or know of some of the many books on the market telling us that literary reading is indeed good for one's mental health. There's been a plethora of such books on sale in the UK, at least. I don't know whether this is true elsewhere. So here are some covers of some bestsellers. In the Emergency Poet and Anti-Stress Poetry Anthology, Deborah Almer prescribes verses from William Wordsworth, Gerald Manley Hopkins and Christina Rossetti for stress relief or as emotional pick-me-ups amid the pressures of modern life. Stressed, Unstressed, classic poems to ease the mind, offers poems for grieving, for feeling alone, for living with uncertainty, and for moving on. Jonathan Bate, who's one of the editors, was a professor at Liverpool some time ago. William Sieghardt's The Poetry Pharmacy identifies poems, almost though not quite exclusively, from the 20th century to help depression, hopelessness, feelings of unreality, regret, and obsession. Turning from poetry to fiction, the best-selling The Novel Cure, an A to Z of literary remedies, is described by its authors as a medical handbook with a difference. And how? You're as likely to find a cure within these pages for a broken heart as for a broken leg, the introduction boldly announces. And alongside very serious life matters, from emotional abandonment, the loss of trust, anorexia to panic attacks, curative novels are suggested for matters as varied as burning the dinner and for burning with desire. Now, despite the risk that some of these books sometimes run of caricaturing the value of literary texts, these trade titles are nevertheless seeking to recover and to popularise for contemporary audiences a notion of the power of literary reading as a form of life support, which is by no means a new one. On the contrary, the power of literature as an ally to the modern therapeutic sciences, for example, has long been recognised. The 20th century Freudian philosopher Paul Ricoeur claimed for literature a profoundly enabling function within the therapeutic endeavour itself. A literary work is not closed in on itself. It opens up a horizon of possible experience, a world distinct from the one in which we live, a world it might be possible to inhabit. It proposes to the imagination for meditation sample cases which constitute thought experiments. This idea of literature as offering sample cases for meditation has been pursued, albeit separately, by contemporary psychologists interested in the transformative potential of literature for its readers. In such stuff as Dreams, The Psychology of Fiction, the Canadian psychologist Keith Oatley at the University of Toronto describes fiction as the mind's flight simulator. Through extensive psychological experiments, Oatley and his colleagues have demonstrated that literary narratives offer readers immersive, simulative models of the social world and social interactions, and that these can facilitate understanding of others who are different from ourselves. This in turn can augment our capacity for empathy and social inference. Fiction, says Oatley, is not just a slice of life, not just entertainment, not just escape from the everyday. It is a model that we as readers construct in collaboration with the writer, which can enable us to see others and ourselves more clearly. Likening what happens in fiction reading to the phenomenon of mirror neurons, the phenomenon of the same neurons firing when a task is performed and when it is perceived to be performed, Oatley says, When we understand an action as we read about it in a novel, our understanding depends on making a version of the action ourselves inwardly. And these active mental models extend the reader's repertoire of emotion, experience, empathy, and make humans more adaptable and responsive as social beings. Now, this contemporary research, or very modern research, demonstrates empirically that fiction can indeed achieve the ambition which the 19th century novelist George Eliot, who founded the tradition of realism in fiction, of a realist narrative, which is very close to, of course, to the concerns of narrative medicine. It's actually empirically demonstrating just the kind of function which she sought for it. The only effect I ardently long to produce by my writings is that those who read them should be able to feel the pain of those who differ from themselves in everything but the broad fact of being struggling, erring creatures. George Eliot, from whom I'll be reading again in a moment, exemplifies how across the centuries, the most powerful and influential voices on the beneficent power of literary reading have been those of readers who are also writers. The idea that literary works can be an aid to life in trouble has been around literally for ages, long before the therapeutic sciences got into this or were even established formally. And I want to begin by drawing on the work of one of these, the early 17th century writer and cleric Robert Burton. And I do this partly in homage to my colleague and collaborator, Professor Chris Dowrick, who's a professor in primary care here at the University of Liverpool. He's a world-renowned expert on depression, as well as practicing GP, a general practitioner. Burton's monumental treatise, The Anatomy of Melancholy, is an important touchstone for Chris Dowrick's work and his book, especially Beyond Depression, in which Chris argues compellingly for a humanized approach to treating mental illness, with an emphasis on the importance of clinicians helping patients to tell a new story of their personal lives in place of dispensing prescriptions of medication. This book, Beyond Depression, was the inspiration for the first study I was involved in with Chris on reading and mental health, a study which investigated the potential of literary reading to alleviate symptoms of depression. I'll come back to that later. Burton is important to Chris Dowrick as an important corrective to the tendency of modern Western medicine to categorize depression as an aberration, a disease, because he regarded melancholy, what today we would label depression, as both a condition to be treated and as the essential aspect of being human. Melancholy, he said, is a natural infirmity, a most powerful adversary. Who labours not of this disease? All are subject to passions, and melancholy above all others. The wisest, greatest philosophers of most excellent wit, reason, judgment, divine spirits, such as are sound in body and mind, Stoics, heroes, Homer's gods, cannot moderate themselves in this behalf. All are subject to melancholy, and that all included Burton himself, who, as Chris Dowrick eloquently puts it, wrote not only as a spiritual physician, but as a fellow melancholic. The writing of the Anatomy of Melancholy was itself a form of self-care. I write on melancholy by being busy to avoid melancholy. As writing was a form of personal therapy for Burton, so he saw not only the content of his book, but the process of reading it as offering healing, performing cure through its pages. My lines shall not only recreate, but rectify the mind. Now, reading is one of the many pursuits Burton suggests for counteracting melancholy. Be not solitary, be not idle are his watchwords. And the word which occurs again and again in describing the effect of these pursuits is that verb, recreate. To revive the body and recreate the mind, recreate the soul. This is the task, this is the labour for the chronic melancholic, he says, to find new life within a story gone wrong, like a second creation after and inside the fall. I especially love the fact that he uses that word in relation to reading, because it gives a whole new dimension and meaning to our common phrase, recreational reading. How reading might, line by line, recreate in Burton's sense is what I hope to give some practical demonstration of in what follows. And in that endeavour, I turn to a touchstone of my own. If Chris Dowrick's book was the medical inspiration and support for the first steps we took in reading and mental health research, the literary inspiration was surely the novel from which the passage I'm about to read to you is taken. It's from Middlemarch by the 19th century writer George Eliot, who I mentioned a moment ago, and the bicentenary of whose birth was celebrated in 2019. I choose it in part because if I were pressed to choose the book that has helped me most in my own life and continues to do so, it would be this one. But I choose this passage in particular because I find in it a kind of shorthand reminder, a powerful clue in miniature of what serious writing might offer to people in trouble. The passage concerns the heroine of the novel, Dorothea Brooke. She's on her honeymoon after her dreadfully innocent mistake of marrying a much older cleric scholar, Mr. Casaubon. And Dorothea's state of mind is explicitly offered by George Eliot as an example of normal unhappiness, the kind of melancholy that Burton well understood. It's nothing very exceptional, we're told. Many souls in their young nudity are left to find their feet in such circumstances, she says. Some discouragement, some faintness of heart is not unusual. Dorothea had no distinctly shapen grievance that she could state even to herself. However, Dorothea was crying, and if she'd been required to state the cause, she could only have done so in general words. To have been driven to be more particular would have been like trying to give a history of the lights and shadows. For that new real future, which was replacing the imaginary, drew its material from the endless minutiae by which her view of Mr. Casaubon and her wifely relation, now that she was married to him, was gradually changing with the secret motion of a watch hand from what it had been in her maiden dream. It was too early yet for her fully to recognize or at least admit the change. But she was now in an interval when the very force of her nature heightened its confusion. Dorothea cannot yet identify the cause of her unhappiness, in part because that cause is a hidden and continuing process, as secret as the motion of a watch hand. And this isn't for Dorothea an interval in which progress is being made from one state to another. All that she senses is that there is something incontrovertibly wrong, but not identifiably there. To have been driven to be more particular would have been like trying to give a history of the lights and shadows. There is only the sensation of need or lack, of an unnameable crisis, where nothing outside clearly signals what the matter is. In the novel, Dorothea eventually turns to a doctor. That would likely be the first person to whom someone in trouble might turn today. Very often a person thus in need, experiencing distress, apparently without external cause, would be diagnosed with depression and possibly given medication. They might be glad of the help too, since all they have otherwise is vague indefiniteness, an inner life without an inner voice to think it or to speak it. Even the most sensitively humane GP, committed to understanding his or her patients through carefully listening to and engaging with their distress, might be tempted to fall back on a prepackaged, modern therapeutic way of speaking or a stereotypically cliched vocabulary of the personal. The kind of language which George Eliot ventriloquizes just before this moment. You just need to find your feet. That's what conventional wisdom would say to Dorothea. But this is the vocabulary which George Eliot puts in inverted commas and which she avoids. Instead, as a writer, she seeks to find the person in a deep sense and at a deep level beneath the stereotype, diagnosis, or formulaic case. What I love about this moment and why I've chosen it is that at no point does she specifically say what is wrong. And that's why a passage like this would never make its way into the anthologies I cited earlier, which, remember, were eager to identify and categorize the wrong symptoms that a given poem or novel could put right. What George Eliot does here, brilliantly and with amazing stamina, she does this for a whole chapter, is inhabit the very indefiniteness from which Dorothea suffers. George Eliot's language in place of Dorothea's crying occupies that barely experienceable interval where something is happening, some big thing is originating itself secretly before it can emerge in explicit formulation in Dorothea herself. It was too early yet for her fully to recognize or at least admit the change. Like the best ideal doctor or counsellor, George Eliot takes seriously the human trouble which does not have a ready name or diagnosis and enters the inchoate and indeterminate areas of individual experience in order to be the articulate witness of thoughts which exist within Dorothea. They only belong to her, yet which, immersed in her predicament, she cannot yet think for herself. And this is what I'm suggesting literary language can potentially do for those of us who are not writers, who do not have the ideal doctor, counsellor, or friend, or they're just not available. They can offer a witness to deeply inner and private and rarely expressible human matter. As a 19th century religious poet, Christina Rossetti put it, we lack but cannot fix upon the lack, not this, not that, yet somewhat, certainly, somewhat, certainly. It's a paradox. And a poem may not fulfill the lack it expresses, no more might it exactly specify, fix upon just what it is that is missing. What it can strenuously do is underwrite the intuitive certainty of an inner need and longing, the vague sense of lack made at least definite and certain, and this is crucial, made humanly normal, not a disease. So literature widens and enriches the human scope. It accepts and allows for troubles, for traumas, for inadequacies, for failures, as part of common existence, related not to a pathological case, but to the whole spectrum of normative human being. Literature offers to sufferers a representation of sadness or difficulty or turmoil as the human norm without merely normalizing that trouble or that experience in a reductive way. The reading group gets it out in the open, said one participant, I'll call her Linda, in our study of reading and depression. Whatever is hidden, up and out. If you've got feelings put down, they've got to come up and out. Otherwise your head would explode. Gets it out, whatever is hidden. Literary reading is at its most reparative, our empirical studies show, when it hits on and discloses some hitherto unnameable it, a hidden whatever, that is the more powerful and real and damaging for not being expressed. The greatest threat to psychic health, said the 20th century psychotherapist Wilfred Bion, whose thinking has been another essential touchstone for me in thinking about why reading is good for us, The greatest threat to psychic health is the inability to think our own emotions, to translate raw, inchoate feeling into a thought which brings release and active doing. Failure to eat, drink, or breathe properly has disastrous consequences for life itself. Failure to use emotional experience produces a comparable disaster in the development of the personality. This failure is serious because, in addition to the obvious penalties that follow from an inability to learn from experience, there is a need for an awareness of an emotional experience, and lack of such awareness implies a deprivation of truth, and truth seems to be essential for psychic health. Beyond's real worry is that if we too readily translate that emotional experience into easy formulations, containers, as he calls them, symptom, illness, for example, then that disaster won't go away. On the contrary, it will only go on all the more hiddily doing its damage. So let me turn now, as I promised, to some of the research that we've done in relation to real readers like Linda. I do apologise for this. I'm apparently still in the meeting, but I had to leave in a hurry. I don't know whether you can see what's coming through, but I'm loath to kind of pause my screen and get rid of it. Does anyone want to advise me on this? Is it terribly distracting?
I don't think it's distracting. But your talk is so fascinating that you easily forget the small clicks. So okay. I think you shouldn't change it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So I will continue. Yes, as I say, let me now turn to some of our research in relation to real readers like Linda. I'm proud to say that one of the most systematic bodies of empirical work looking at the influence of literary reading upon mental health has taken place here at the University of Liverpool. For much of the last decade, I was based at the Centre for Research into Reading, Literature and Society, an interdisciplinary collaboration of literary and linguistic specialists. With health experts in medicine, Chris Dyrick among them, and in psychology, the Centre has carried out research on a very specific model of reading, community shared reading, pioneered and developed by award-winning UK charity, The Reader, also founded here in Liverpool by Jane Davis. And with these are screenshots from their website, by the way. They have their headquarters in this rather beautifully refurbished mansion house. Some of you already may be familiar with this fantastic organisation and its amazing work in promoting shared reading across the country and now the world. But for the benefit of the uninitiated, let me just outline what shared reading is. In shared reading, people come together weekly in small groups of up to 12 to read aloud together a poem or story or novel. They read novels over a number of weeks, but the emphasis is on reading aloud. The material is not read in advance nor confined to contemporary works. The material is not pre-selected with a particular condition or mood in mind. It's not chosen for its targeted relevance, as in self-help bibliotherapy. The groups are led by trained facilitators or reader leaders, and works and authors from the literary heritage down the ages are read aloud together live. Reading is regularly paused for group members to share thoughts and responses, or reflect on thoughts or memories the literary work has stirred. So group members control their own involvement, contributing or reading aloud themselves as much or as little as they wish. And the reader brings the reading of serious literature to a variety of settings to include people who would not normally be involved in reading literature. So people in drug rehabilitation centres, prisons, hospitals, drop-in centres, in local medical practices, dementia care homes, facilities for looked after children, schools and libraries. And currently there are more than 600 reader groups meeting weekly across the UK and in Europe and beyond. The reader's shared reading model consciously builds on a tradition formed in the Victorian age by writers including George Eliot and Charles Dickens, among others, to create communities of readers in search of meaning. The multidisciplinary team at CRILS, our research centre, Centre for Reading Research, undertook a series of groundbreaking studies of the impact of shared reading in some of these health contexts. We use standard psychological measures of mental health and well-being, the kind of measures routinely used by general practitioners and clinicians to assess people's mental health, in order to quantify the impact of shared reading. I'll show you some sample results in a moment. We found statistically significant improvements in symptom alleviation and in quality of life for people living with depression, with dementia, and with chronic pain. And such findings have been of interest to health practitioners and commissioners who require this kind of evidence to justify the inclusion of a reading programme in their clinics or surgeries. And no wonder they need such evidence. There is something astounding about these figures, even to me, and I was leading some of these studies. Astounding, I say, because if we leave aside the recent pandemic, depression, dementia, and pain are the new Western epidemics affecting the health of the population in the West on an unprecedented scale. How commissioners and medics might be forgiven for asking, how can something as soft as a poem or story, something so intangible and immaterial, influence such obdurate and tenacious conditions as these? In a sense, these figures pose as many questions as they answer. Quantitative measures might show us that reading works, but they cannot answer the more interesting question of how or why. So our labour at our research centre and our task has been to find a repertoire of quantitative and qualitative methods that are equal to the task of answering, however approximately, that question: how does reading alleviate symptoms of mental ill health in individual people? The reason I can describe so closely in what follows what happens in the reading groups is because all reading group sessions in our studies have been audio-video recorded and transcribed with the informed consent of participants as required by National Health Service ethical protocols. This was one of our centre's methodological innovations. The recordings and transcriptions were then analysed by a multidisciplinary research team of linguists, literary experts, medics, and psychologists. Selections from the video recordings regarded as significant collectively by the research team were then shown to group participants at individual interview. And the participant testimony I use here comes largely from those one-to-one interviews. In the representative example I'm going to talk about now, the readers I refer to and quote from come from different shared reading groups in different parts of the UK. They have different experiences of reading, and they are struggling with different mental health issues, addiction, mild to moderate depression, for example. But they are all responding to this poem, John Clare's I Am. It's a tried and tested favourite in shared reading groups. Indeed, if you've watched reader director Jane Davis's TED lecture on reading, which I urge you to do, you'll find that this poem was critical to the very founding of the reader. Let me read some of the poem to you. I am, yet what I am, none cares or knows. My friends forsake me like a memory lost. I am the self-consumer of my woes. They rise and vanish in oblivious host, like shadows in love's frenzied, stifled throes. And yet I am and live, like vapours, tossed into the nothingness of scorn and noise, into the living sea of waking dreams, where there is neither sense of life or joys, but the vast shipwreck of my life's esteems. Even the dearest that I loved the best are strange, nay, rather, stranger than the rest. Reading this poem in a group which is part of a recovery programme for drug and alcohol addiction, one group member, whom I'll call Carol, all names I use are pseudonyms, said, "It's really hit me, right there," pointing to her chest, and holding up her hand to signal that she needed some time or some space, and visibly tearful, Carol suddenly left the room. Another reader called Mike, a journalist, in a different community group for people experiencing depression, also left the room abruptly immediately after the poem had been read. Afterwards, he explained that the words went in and struck something directly right inside. Alice, a counsellor, once a nurse, forcibly retired through pain, said, "It touched something in me quite suddenly. I had no idea that would happen." This kind of involuntary emotional and neo-physical connection to the literary work, it struck or touched something, is very common. Indeed, it's usual when people have a powerful response to a passage or poem. It's often the very first point of entry. It sort of hit me in the face. The reading can get to feelings very quickly. It's almost condensed. You can feel it deep inside. The poem really zeroed in on my feelings, laid them bare. Such testimony from readers at interview verified our finding from witnessing the video recordings across the studies, that the literary material was putting the readers in touch and in place with resonant areas of deep self, deep emotional matter. And very often, this felt inner resonance left readers bereft of an immediate vocal response. Carol's and Mike's instinctive need to leave the room in response to this poem is the extreme and dramatic version of what we have found to be characteristic when readers were moved. Literature can powerfully disrupt norms of social conversation and behaviour, precisely by taking readers into complex areas of emotion and experience for which, as with Dorothea in that passage from Middlemarch, there are no simple names or categories. And these are often extremely uncomfortable areas that people are unused to visiting, the raw stuff that's hard to get down to or otherwise difficult to locate or recover. Yet no one would willingly go to these inner places. Why would you choose to come back week after week to a shared reading group if it has this effect? Why not opt instead for the relative comfort of the book reading group? When I asked Mike at interview why, if poetry hurts in the way it clearly hurt him when he left the room, when I asked him why he came back in, why he kept coming back to the group, he said, "I needed this language. I've been to other groups, where you're all sitting there because you're ill and talking about how you feel terrible, everything's gone wrong. Here there were particular words." Let me go back to the poem. "Here there were particular words, I remember, something about turmoil and being tossed on the sea. I'm feeling it now. When it's very close to the surface, my emotions, I guess, are trying to sort of put it together. I needed this language. I am, just to say, I am. That is something, isn't it?" When people suggest that it might be somehow elitist or patronizing to take great literature out of universities and into the world, I often quote this example because the person needing this language in this instance is a highly successful writer and journalist of social affairs. In England, the UK, if you take the broadsheet newspapers, it's very likely that you'll have read his work. He's not conventionally inarticulate, that's what I'm saying, but he needs this language. Why? Because this emotionally expressive language external to himself helps to find his own feelings internally. Reading can release something you didn't know was there. But he also needs it, Mike, precisely because the poem is not prescribing a cure. It's neither demanding nor expecting to have an effect on the reader or to produce a change. It's very common for shared reading participants to compare the authenticity and spontaneity of their response to literary texts to their prior experience of therapy or self-help literature. The language of support groups, remember, was no use to Mike. Participants of shared reading often explicitly value how literature permits them not to think of themselves as cases. Oh, I'm not going mad. Someone else has had this experience. Somebody else is feeling that way. That's quite a common response. A participant in a group for people living with chronic pain said, "There's never any judgment. When you read something or say something, there's no return to the therapist. There's no why, what, when, where, who, or why don't you, how did you feel, why did you do that? You're not asked to relate personally. you just do. And this voluntariness, or rather, as we've seen more truly, involuntariness of response is crucial. The poem doesn't know or care whether you are well or ill, and it's not expecting anything from you. On the contrary, this cry in this poem, I am, yet what I am, none cares or knows. This cry is not uttered in the expectation that someone will know or will care. It is uttered into the nothingness of scorn and noise. All the more moving then, that the transmission of its pain should be picked up hundreds of years later, like a kind of remote telegraphic signal, as the authentic, articulate witness of another's otherwise hidden, secret suffering. Now, I'm still constantly struck by how the relatively simple formula of shared reading, a book, a group of people reading aloud, has the potential to be more radical in its operation than formal therapy. And just to give you, as I promised I would, some hard statistics on this, I turn now almost finally to a study in which we compared shared reading with a formal therapy, with cognitive behavioural therapy as treatments for chronic pain. So cognitive behavioural therapy is the standard psychosocial treatment for chronic pain and part of routine provision for chronic pain patients at the Royal Liverpool Hospital, which was our partner on this study. I'll just give you a bit of background. The study came about because the pain consultants at the Royal Liverpool, who became our collaborators, had heard about our research on reading and depression and asked whether we might carry out a similar study at the Chronic Pain Clinic. You may already know this, but just to run through it, chronic pain is officially defined as pain which lasts for more than 3 months after injury or tissue healing has occurred. So it's the point at which biologically or biologically there should be no pain at all. Chronic pain is very common, afflicting, it's estimated, between 10 and 50% of the Western population. It's a complex experience affecting thought, mood, behaviour, and often leads to isolation, immobility, and drug dependence. And that's why there's such a close resemblance and intimate relationship between pain and depression. Pain is depressing, depression causes and intensifies pain. People with chronic pain have 3 times the average risk of developing psychiatric symptoms, mood or anxiety disorders, and depressed patients have 3 times the average risk of developing chronic pain. In fact, the pain clinicians with whom I've been working often feel that they shouldn't use the word pain at all in relation to their patients. What they really have, they tell me, is suffering. They don't have a localized symptom. Their whole life is awful. So in our study, we used standard self-report measures of psychological health to measure the impact on mood and emotional affect before and after exposure to shared reading and CBT. So in this case, at the start of the study, before the intervention began, and again at the end of the study, after 6 months. And there was a consistent tendency for involvement in both group activities, it was group CBT, to be associated with self-report of improved mental health and well-being. The participants, however, were also keeping 12-hourly pain and emotion diaries, recording how they felt physically and mentally and emotionally twice a day over a period of 6 months. And that's how we were able to show that there was a prolonged effect on pain and mood. People felt better on the evening after shared reading and for 2 days afterwards, which was a result not observable with CBT. And this held good significantly, despite the fact that the emotional impact reported immediately after the shared reading session was sometimes a so-called negative one. People felt upset, they cried. That's to say, the book or poem might have engaged difficult emotion or evoked painful memories, as we saw with Carol and with Mike, but the effect of that was not itself negative, rather the opposite. People were often much more engaged subsequently after a session in which some kind of emotional awakening had happened than they had been before. And we know this because we also assessed mood and emotion immediately after every shared reading and CBT session using the positive and negative affect scale, or PANAS. And we found that while there was a consistent tendency for both activities to produce a greater positive than negative effect on mood and emotion, shared reading elicited more and more intense feeling than CBT, more joy, and more intense feeling at both ends of the spectrum, so more intense joy as well as more intense sadness, without the evocation of the so-called negative feeling, sadness or upset, impacting on overall improvement in psychological well-being. This would have come as no surprise to Wilfred Bion, of course, with his insistence on the importance of having access to the deepest truths of ourselves, however difficult. Yet the consultants with whom we worked were struck to find that, as they put it, some of the things we're trying to achieve in CBT, and so they were trying to help people to realise their pain at some level of thinking. Some of the things we plant the seed of there come out in a different and emotionally realised way in shared reading, an emotionally realised way. And this is because literary reading, as we've already seen, works outside in at one level. It hit me, it struck me as a sudden moving surprise, but it also works from below upwards. In shared reading, says my valued colleague and collaborator, psychologist Professor Mian Corcoran, the executive brain gets to work with genuine, spontaneous, and owned gut or heart responses, and becomes involved in integrating them into models of the world. This is an explanation, of course, of how literary reading can help us to achieve what for Bion is the all-important matter for psychic health, authentically thinking one's emotional experience. The statistical finding of the emotional range evoked by shared reading correlated strongly with the linguistic analysis of the transcribed video recordings of both interventions, which found, so that this is where we're looking, not speaking to people at interview, but actually looking at the video recordings themselves. So we found that in CBT, participants focused exclusively on their pain with no thematic deviation. CBT was characterized, in fact, by a language of lack. There was a strong sense of a reduced or diminished life. I'm defined now by my pain. I'm not who I was before. And what CBT seemed to offer to participants was an opportunity or permission to express what they experienced overall as a sense of subtraction, of every little thing being taken away, as one participant put it rather terribly. In shared reading, by contrast, the literature was a trigger to recall a wide range of diverse life experiences of work, childhood, family members, relationships related to the entire lifespan, not merely the time period affected by pain. And linguistic evidence from these transcripts, but also from the interviews, the diaries, the self-report, was that vocabulary for emotion, good and bad, painful and joyful, was massively expanded for participants in shared reading over the course of the study, and was often demonstrably inflected by the words of the poem or the prose narrative. And this is a very pressing consideration in the case of chronic pain, as it is in the case of many symptoms of mental ill health, self-harm included, where there's a strong link between suppression of emotion or the inability to express emotions, what psychologists call alexithymia, and the experience of pain. But there is a paradox here. I know I have to finish very shortly. If reading is therapeutic by trying not to be, as I've been insisting, how do we incorporate it into public and mental health service provision to make sure that those who need it can access it, and yet do so without damage to the reading experience, without turning it into a formal therapy or formal intervention? In the chronic pain study, we concluded that shared reading might be considered and might operate as an adjunct or primer to formal therapy, as well as existing in its own right. So just to give two concluding examples of how this is working, if I may very briefly. So shared reading is now part of the pain management programme for patients, and this is one of the patients at the pain clinic at Royal Liverpool and Broad Green Hospital. It has continued to produce sustained change for patients who, in the evaluations done by the reader, report a reduction in isolation. They experience a kind of distraction from the pain and improved mental concentration while they're in the group. And this is Helen, who is a member of the reading group. We studied, and in this she's speaking for a public video recording for the reader about her experience. And having attended the reading group for 2 years, she completed a volunteer training course to become a group leader herself, ran an online reading group for pain patients throughout lockdown, and was interviewed last year on BBC television to talk of her experience. And she said on that interview, shared reading has given me my life back, very movingly. And to give a second and final example, one of our research partners, Merseycare NHS Foundation Trust, is a specialist provider of mental health care in the North West England, and it prioritises a non-clinical and community-focused approach. It works with non-HS organisations, arts organisations like the Reader, in order to encourage social inclusion and to challenge particularly the stigma attached to mental illness. At its life rooms, or these are community hubs around the city region, shared reading, I hope you can see it here, is offered as an activity, not an intervention, alongside a range of provision. So it keeps its integrity here as a life activity for all. It's not harnessed to a narrow therapeutic agenda. And shared reading's primary reliance on the literary stimulus, and I want to come back to this, and on reading aloud, is one thing that was really prized by the former medical director at Merseycare, who was a forensic psychiatrist and ran a reading group in a secure ward in Ashworth Secure Hospital. He said rather wonderfully of shared reading that the book becomes the expert. You know, he was released from that responsibility and the authority of being the expert for the time that he was reading the book. But he also said it in addition, and I wanted to leave you with this because it brings us back to the fact that shared reading is literary reading aloud, and that's a really important aspect of its power. And Dave Fernley had this to say about reading aloud. I'll just leave you with this. When a poem or story is read aloud, making every word and every line a close, vocal, emotional presence, the reader's response is likely to be situated in the body as the biological substrate of an emotion before it ever reaches mental awareness or consciously understood meaning. The primary emotion involved in literary response will almost inevitably be closer to earlier life. Reading is a form of emotional archaeology in that it can take a person back to early experiences before adult stress patterns took hold or hardened into ill health. It can get underneath habitual categories and frames, those of identity, as well as of medical condition. And he also said that reading's operation at pre-linguistic and pre-verbal levels allows connections to be made at a point of need, which may be more primary and more personally relevant than formal diagnosis and treatment, or than the individuals themselves could consciously locate or touch off. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very, very interesting, enlightening and deep lecture.
Stop sharing now. Would that make
yes,
sense?
please. And then we could have comments and questions. And if you just raise your yellow hand or blue hand or whatever color it is, you can please ask question or give comments to this wonderful lecture. Will be the first to say something, ask or comment, please. Yeah, Christine, are you raising your hand or just?
Well, I wrote the question in the chat also. Thank you so much. It was a great talk, really inspiring. I was wondering, as a researcher in sex differences, whether there are gender responses or gender differences in the response to shared reading.
very interesting. I mean, you probably do know that we're more likely to see women than men at reading groups, and so the demographic is not huge. But I would say, rather astonishingly, that I don't think I can say that there is. Now, that it would be really interesting though to do a study in terms of the capacity for men and women to be moved in the ways that I've talked about. I'm not conscious of a difference. It's not the case, for example, that there might be a stereotypical division between a woman who might cry and a man who might not. And I've seen both men and women cry. I've seen both men and women very able to express their emotions. Now, likewise, and this is something I'm going to talk about in the workshop afterwards, the inarticulacy that can suddenly follow upon being very moved, you know, a kind of not being able to talk, not being able to articulate anything, including sorrow in non-verbal ways, is also common across the board. But I would love somebody to do this study, because that's my impression. This isn't something that we have studied, and it might be quite difficult to do because a lot of our on our current material, because a lot of the participants are women. I mean, and one of our studies was in a women's prison, so by definition we can't you know, make that comparison. But it's a really, really interesting question. Mm-hmm. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. And Anna, will you have a question? Anna Paldam Folker. I think the sound is, we can't hear you. Something is wrong. Okay. While you're trying to fix the microphone, I perhaps can ask a question, and we'll return to you, Anna. I think you said something very interesting. You said a lot of interesting things, but I noted here in the last paragraphs, you said the book becomes the expert. And that's an interesting thought to me. I completely understand what you mean, but and I think we with reading groups here in Denmark have experienced the same, that the book becomes the expert. But that there might be better experts books than other. What do you think of this? Which books are the best experts in your opinion? Is that the Victorian literature that you're specialized in, or contemporary literature? Or, yeah.
So I apologise for being looking almost exclusively at Victorian literature there, but yes, I'm a Victorian, so that's the reason. But no, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily the best literature. I do think, so this is a really difficult one. So one way of answering that is, you might have gathered that I'm a bit skeptical of those books that say, read this poem to cure this problem, because you probably have experienced this yourself, that different works of literature work for different people. I mean, I happened to hit on something there that worked for a lot of people, but we talk about poems or passages landing on participants. And it's as if when that happens, it might not work for anybody else in the room in quite the same kind of way, but when it does work for one person, they almost become the expert, because they are the person who speaks to that experience or feels that at that moment they embody that experience. So that's one way of answering your question, which is to say, I think there are as many potentially, you know, good sources as there are people, because you know, literature is inexhaustible as a resource, and I think that's one great thing about it. I do think, and this is a really difficult one, we do emphasize serious literature. I mean, and across the ages, from you know, from I guess we go back as far as Shakespeare, but right up to the contemporary day, Marilyn Robinson. And it's so hard, isn't it? It's how do we define serious literature? But it's probably easier to make those choices when the literature has been around a long time. But I think it's a really important choice to make, that the literature as one of my teachers used to say to me, is telling the truth.
Yeah.
And this is a really hard one. That's a really hard one, because I'm a hostage to fortune here. What on earth did she mean? But I knew what she meant, and I knew when literature wasn't doing that. I don't know how helpful that is, but yes, quality, serious literature, but of any age. Yeah.
Great. And Anna wants to ask you whether shared reading, have you found that it's beneficial for everyone, that is all patient groups?
Yes. Okay, I'm just looking at the second question as well. Yes, across the patient groups that we've studied, yes, it's been beneficial for them all. And I think this is because, I mean, we have been looking at patient groups who have been diagnosed with some kind of mental ill health. So, and I guess it's not, you know, so surprising that what can often accompany that mental ill health is a kind of an inability to feel very intensely. So, and I think that's why we have the finding that any feeling that is evoked or powerfully galvanized by reading does some good. And it's very difficult to know. I mean, people do who are stuck in those kind of difficulties do need to be surprised out of that kind of groove that they're into. And that's why I think we have most success with people who are not usually readers, because they don't expect reading to do it. They really don't.
Well, Christine has another question in the chat, whether someone has studied if shared reading might be more effective than watching and discussing an emotion movie. That's a genre of the art forms of movie and shared readings, reading books, watching movies. A short comment.
We haven't done a study of this, though. Yesterday, I run a module on an MA on called Arts, Mental Health and Wellbeing. And yesterday, one of my colleagues was giving a session. I wasn't able to attend it, but I know of her work on the use of movies and music, old movies and older music for people in dementia care homes. And, I mean, this has been very, very powerful as a way of evoking memory. So I think it would be, with certain groups, I think it would be a fantastic study to do, and to think about the kind of packages of I can't get away from this word intervention, but packages of activities that might be really helpful, particularly in care homes where there is often a dearth, particularly in the UK, a dearth of such meaningful and authentic and inspiring activities. So that sounds like a good study, actually.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for this question too, and for this comment. Well, we are close to finishing this event, and I would just like to thank you so much, Professor Billington, for sharing your knowledge with us. We hope that you'll visit us once again online or in real life. Your idea is very important to our future work, indeed. So thank you very much for joining us here, and thank you to all the participants. We hope to see you again here in Diaz. You know, we have these lectures every Wednesday, a lot of different things to choose from, and this was an example of how great an event at Diaz can be. So please join us once again, and thank you, Professor Billington, for being here. Bye-bye.